This is the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. This is a show about ideas, people, and behaviors that are considered inappropriate, out of bounds, or beyond the pale. The things you're not supposed to talk about if you're a school teacher, a college professor, a businessman, a politician, a parent, a neighbor, or even a podcast host. These are the things you're not supposed to say or even think if you're a good liberal, a good conservative, or a good citizen. Each week, I'll interview a person who has something bad to say. They might be a journalist or a professor. They might be a porn star or a drug dealer. They might just be an ordinary person with an ordinary job who doesn't care about the rules of polite society. I'm not interested in breaking the rules just to be a troublemaker. I'm interested in people who break the rules of conventional thought and to expand the scope of what is possible to say in our society. I'm interested in people who make me think. Many people insist that history effectively began on October 7th, and that the events of that day should be judged accordingly. But it is simply impossible to understand why innocent civilians were shot to death or taken hostage on that day, or why now there are hundreds of children lying under rubble in Gaza, without understanding the history of a place that not very long ago was called Palestine. This is my interview with the historian Zach Foster. I am joined from Mexico City by Zachary Foster, who is a historian who I recently became aware of because he is a historian of Palestine, of all things. Something you're really not supposed to do in certain ways, I think. But and I also found you, Zach, in my research into and discovery of Jewish anti-Zionists, which I am finding is an extremely rich tradition, I guess I would say. It is definitely a tradition, and it's about 100 years old, in fact, at least. But yeah, and you're one of those. And you've also you visited Gaza and the West Bank and Israel many, many times. So I wanted to ask you, first of all, how did you get there? Right. And so let's do the background, who you are, where you come from, why on earth you chose this path in life, which doesn't get you anywhere. I don't know if you're aware of that, but being pro-Palestinian, especially as a Jew, is not the best career move. So you're from the Midwest, right?
That's right. Yeah, I grew up in a suburb of Detroit.
Right. And we talked before we record. I won't say where, but I know it well. I spent a lot of time in your hometown. And your family is Jewish, but also I take it they were and are still Zionist?
Yes, that's correct. I would say every single member of my family, except for myself, is Zionist and Jewish. And yes, that's correct.
Wow. And so what was that? I mean, to what extent when you were growing up, was that a part of your life and a part of what you were taught?
Look, I went to Jewish schools growing up, Jewish summer camps, Jewish youth groups. Also, I went to Zionist summer camps, Zionist youth groups, and Zionist schools, right? They were all Zionists. They were also all Jewish. So yeah, I was very much raised to believe Israel is my homeland, to celebrate Israel's Independence Day the same way I would celebrate Hanukkah or Passover, to raise and wave the Israeli flag just as I would the American flag. If anything, I would say that I became more curious and more interested and more loyal and more passionate about the state of Israel than I did about the United States. And so spent a semester in Jerusalem as an undergrad at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, traveled to the Balkans with a group of half American Jews and half American Palestinians. And I think that was one of the first turning points for me to get back to the question around, how did I wind up being a Jewish anti-Zionist? Mm-hmm. Here we are in these dialogues, hours and hours at a time, crying, screaming, sharing stories, talking politics. And there's just one thing that kept coming up in those dialogues. And the Palestinian Americans kept kept confronting us with the same question, which was, why is it that you, as American Jews, who may have never been to Israel, may not have any Israeli relatives, may have no connection, no knowledge of the country whatsoever, you have a right to go claim citizenship in Israel, Palestine. Whereas us, Palestinians, whose parents and grandparents are from there and were born there, we do not have that right. Why is that? And I think the answer is like, I don't have a good answer. You're absolutely right. Like, you should have the right. Like, you should certainly have the right ahead of me. And I think that was kind of the starting point for me, and sort of the beginning of my transition from Zionist to anti-Zionist.
Mm-hmm. It wasn't until well into my adulthood, I think I was even in graduate school, when I first learned that Palestinians did not have a right to return. I mean, that most Palestinians did not have a right to return. I didn't even know that. And and I've heard you speak about this issue in sort of general ways, but that's deliberate, right? I mean, you've talked about the way history is taught in Israeli schools, but I think it's true also in American schools to a large extent, right? We are not told these things, which may be the most basic fact of all, is that this is kind of what the thing's all about, is these people have been expelled and they're not allowed back. Can we do you want to elaborate on that, or can I go to the next question?
Yeah, we can touch on that a bit. I think there's this false perception that, well, because a lot of the Palestinians in 48 left on their own, that therefore they don't have a right to come back. In fact, that's untrue. In international law, refugees have the right to return to their homes at the end of a war. And I think going further than that, we can say that among the 750,000 Palestinian refugees from that war, many hundreds of thousands were expelled by gunpoint in the central coastal plains, as well as in the Galilee, as well as in the south. But also plenty left on their own. And for the same reasons everyone would leave their home during a time of war, right? There's shortages of food, there's violence, no one wants to get caught in the hostilities. But I think what makes 1948 and what makes the Zionist policy of, I think the reason I would characterize what happened in 48 as ethnic cleansing is because Israel prevented them from coming back after the war. And in fact, many tried to. So in the first 2 years, from 1949 to 1951, in the first 2 years after the end of hostilities, many thousands, if not tens of thousands of Palestinians tried to come home. They wanted to come home to see family, to recover lost property, to harvest crops, and they were shot at. Israeli soldiers shot at them mercilessly and killed more than 1,000 unarmed, defenseless Palestinians in just the first 2 years after the end of the 1948 war. And so, yes, that I think means that what happened in 48 was ethnic cleansing. When you do not allow someone to come back to the home after a war, I think that qualifies as ethnic cleansing. And yeah, let's pause it there if you want to shift to talk about something else.
Great. What I want to do is I want to sort of organize this conversation, because there's as you know more than anyone, how much it's such a complicated issue. And this, I think, is a part of why Americans are so ignorant about it, because it's simply difficult to understand. There's so much to learn. And so I think it requires some organization. What I want to try to do with you, if you don't mind, is try to organize our conversation and introduce the history and introduce the arguments and the data and the facts by answering one question. And I mean this, and I want, because this is the only question I've been asked, and I've been asked this question about 59 times a day for the last 5 weeks. Zach Foster, do you condemn Hamas?
I don't know if you intend that to be a joke, but sorry, I found that.
No, I'm very serious in that I'm, as you know, because everybody on our side has been asked this question 59 times a day for 5 weeks. That is the only question apparently anyone's concerned about on the other side. I mean, am I exaggerating? This is all they want to know. They want to know whether you condemn Hamas. And then when you don't condemn Hamas, that means, I'm not sure what it means, but I'm always asking them, so yes, and then what? But anyway, I want to talk about the history through that question.
Yeah.
Right? Because I think that can be the thesis question here. And I think you can bring, I think all of history and all the arguments you bring to bear can be directed at that question, in fact, right? I mean, is that fair? So, decent?
First of all, let's say that I condemn anyone who is killing civilians, who's targeting civilians, and who and who is violating the laws of war and international humanitarian law. So obviously that includes Hamas. Obviously that includes the Israeli military, and many others. Let's take a step back. So international law requires that parties to an armed conflict do two things. Number one is the law of distinction. That is to say, you have to distinguish between military and civilians, military targets and civilians. The second the second principle is the principle of proportionality, which is that the military benefit to an attack has to be proportional to the harm caused to civilians.
Right.
Now, let's break these two down. Let's start with proportionality. So on the proportionality question, there is no moral equivalency between Hamas and Israel. Israel is by far, I think, the greater violator here of this principle of international law. We saw in the Jabalia refugee camp, an Israeli military spokesman go on CNN and essentially say, yes, we knowingly slaughtered hundreds of Palestinian innocent civilians to go after one commander. I mean, that's literally the definition of disproportional. So, and there's something unique about that one strike. The majority of Hamas fighters are underground. The majority of Israeli strikes target people above ground. We're talking almost 11,000 dead Palestinians, the vast majority of whom are civilians. 5,000 children, 70% women and children. So I think in terms of, and this is, by the way, a long-standing Israeli policy, something that's been articulated by almost every single Israeli political leader since 1948. It was Ben-Gurion who in 1953, or was it 1956, told one of the commanders in the Israeli army, Ariel Sharon, he said, the way we're going to solve these Palestinian fedayeen, the way we're going to get rid of them is through disproportionate force. That was an order. I mean, and this has been basically, I think, stated by almost every Israeli leader since, which is we will kill more Palestinians than Palestinians will kill us. You know, during the first Intifada, Palestinians killed 160 Israelis. Israel killed 1,200 Palestinians. During the second Intifada, Palestinians killed 1,000 Israelis. Israelis killed 3,000 Palestinians. In the 2008 war in Gaza, Gazans killed less than a dozen Israelis. Israel killed almost 1,500 Palestinians in Gaza, 2/3 of whom were civilians. 2014, Israel killed 2,200 Palestinians, 1,500 of whom were civilians, while Hamas kills a dozen or two Palestinians.
Well, so originally it was 3, right? I mean, the provocation was 3, and they killed 2,200 in response. So that was that ratio. Yeah.
So I think, and I'm just citing a few examples. It's pretty much the case with every single encounter between Israelis and Palestinians. Is Israel's principle? I would say Israel's military principle is disproportionality. The military is founded on the violation of international law. It's sort of the guiding principle is let's commit war crimes. So I think on the question of disproportionality, there's no question. There is no moral equivalency between Israel and Hamas. Israel is by far, I think, in violation. So, and then distinction, I think it's very clear that both parties are in violation. And I mean, obviously Hamas indiscriminately fires rockets into Israel. Obviously Hamas committed dozens of terrorist attacks over the past 30 years in which it targeted civilians. It killed many hundreds of civilians on October 7th, 2023. No question Hamas is in violation, but of course, no question that Israel is also in violation. I mean, go back to 2007. The stated goal of the blockade was to punish the civilian population of Gaza for having elected Hamas. There, and the blockade has led to tremendous suffering and tremendous loss of life. Thousands of Palestinians have died as a result of the blockade, leaving aside the wars and the aerial strikes. But the blockade itself, it means Palestinians cannot get the medical care they need. And when they apply for exit permits to get the medical care they need, they're denied. And human rights organizations have documented dozens of cases in which Palestinians die as a result of being unable to get the medical care they need, including the case of Fatima al-Masri, a 2-year-old Palestinian girl who died in 2022 because Israel denied her the right to leave Gaza to get the medical care she needed. So, I mean, and then, of course, in all of the major wars that Israel's waged on Gaza, human rights organizations, the UN, the Goldstone. Let's talk about 2008. So in the Goldstone report, they investigated 11 strikes on Gaza, and that resulted in that resulted in the loss of civilian life. In 10 out of 11 cases, there was no military target identified. In other words, 90% of the strikes on Gaza in 2008, 2009 were targeting civilians. I mean, how is that not also a violation of the law of distinction? So I think, so just to summarize the point, I think when trying to compare and contrast Israeli war crimes versus Hamas's war crimes, I think both are very clearly committing war crimes on violating the law of distinction. But I think it's primarily Israel that is committing a violation on the law of proportionality. So on the whole, when you ask me, do I condemn Hamas? I think the better question is like, do you condemn the Israeli military and Hamas, and primarily the Israeli military?
Yeah, I mean, I've thought about this question every day for 5 weeks because I've been forced to, and I'm still thinking aloud about it, and this is why I'm talking to you about it. I mean, you talked about how you really reshaped your entire life around this issue. I mean, and you've devoted much or all or most of your life to not just studying the conflict and the history, but you're clearly a partisan of, I would say, Palestinian people generally. And so, your heart's in it. I mean, a lot of our hearts are in it, but I think yours is in it more than anybody, or more than most people. And I guess I want to ask you the question again, and not that that was a bad answer, but I think there's another layer here. Do you condemn the people who committed the alleged atrocities on October 7th, right? Do you condemn those men with those rifles and those RPGs and the green headbands roaming around southern Israel? Do you condemn those people?
If you allow me to back up, I will address that question, but let me just kind of zoom out a little bit, because I think it is important to talk about individuals and why individuals carry out the acts of violence that they carry out. Like I said, I obviously condemn acts of violence directed towards innocent civilians. So yes, obviously I condemn people who are butchering babies and committing grotesque acts of violence, dropping grenades into people sheltering in bomb shelter. So yes, obviously that is all horrifying. But I do want to zoom out here and talk about what is it that leads people to acts of violence. Hamas was founded by two individuals, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin and Abdulaziz Rantisi. Sheikh Ahmed Yassin was born in the state of Israel, or like in British Mandatory Palestine. And when he was 12 years old, Zionist forces came to his village and ethnically cleansed every single man, woman, and child from his village. And he fled along with his parents to the Gaza Strip. Abdulaziz Rantisi was 8 years old in 1956 when the Israeli military entered the Gaza Strip and occupied the Gaza Strip for 6 months. And on November 3rd, 1956, the Israeli military entered Khan Yunis, which is in the Gaza Strip. And they went door to door, and they found every single man over the age of 15, brought them to the town square, lined them up against the wall, and executed them. And Abdulaziz Rantisi was a 8-year-old boy at the time in the refugee camp, and he bore witness to the events, on the incidents and the massacre. And I think it's important to remember that violence breeds violence. And let me ask you this: how many 8-year-old boys and 12-year-old boys have bore witness to the events of the past month? How many more Hamases are going to be founded? How many more Abdulaziz Rantisis and Sheikh Ahmed Yassins are going to be created just from the violence that was perpetrated against the people of Gaza over the past month? So if you, like I, believe that violence is wrong and condemn the people who committed the acts of violence on October 7th, then do you not also believe that you just went about and created another 20 or another 200 of them, people who are going to go found the next generation of terrorist organizations and commit attacks far worse than those were carried out on October 7th? I think that is the question we need to be asking ourselves, which is, if you actually want to solve for the violence, then why is it that you're committing even more grotesque violence at an order of magnitude greater scale? And not just in terms of killing people, but in terms of maiming people, in terms of starving them and causing them to dehydrate. I mean, literally, there are people dying every single day right now of dehydration. They do not have enough water to drink. We're talking about children dying from dehydration every single day in the Gaza Strip right now.
Oh, that's
and so
yeah. I mean,
go ahead.
I was just going to say that's the tip of the iceberg of the violence being done in Gaza to the people there. I wanted to drill down further though on those men who breached that wall and went into those kibbutzim, and although mostly the military bases, but what are the chances what are the chances that the average one of those guys, the average one of those fighters, has had a close family member killed by an Israeli bomb?
That's a good question. I think there's some been reporting on this, and I'm actually
Has
not
there?
familiar with I believe there has been. I'm not entirely sure about the people who carried out the atrocities themselves.
Well, we
but
don't know, but right.
I think in terms of the Hamas fighters, I think there has been some reporting on this.
Okay.
And so I don't want to misspeak, because I believe we have some evidence and some data that suggests that a very large percentage of the Hamas fighters, themselves, their parents, their brothers, their sisters, their children, have been slaughtered by the state of Israel, by the Israeli military. So yes, I mean that I think is very, very clear. I mean, every single person in Gaza has someone a relative, a close friend, a family member who has been slaughtered by the Israeli military. I mean, in Israel, people are talking about how every single Israeli knows someone who was affected by October 4th, and there are 5 times as many Israelis as there are Palestinians in Gaza. And there are 10 times as many Palestinians who were killed in Gaza just in the past month than there were killed in Israel on October 7th. Yeah. So what's that? 10 times 5, that's 50x in just the past month. Not to mention the past 16 years, you're probably talking about, 100x or maybe 500x. The number of Palestinians have family members and friends whose lives have been stolen from them. So yes, I mean that's quite clear.
I mean, I've heard estimates by people who are basically experts on Hamas that it's almost all of them have had family members, close family members die, and many of them have had children killed, have had parents killed. Many of them are orphans. Who else would they recruit from? I mean, what other people would they recruit to be fighters? Of course, right? And there's no shortage of people in Gaza who have that experience. I mean, right now, isn't the number now like 1 in 200 have been killed in the last 5 weeks? Isn't that the math? It's something like that. Maybe more than that. 1 out of 200 people been killed in the last 5 weeks. This is World War II level stuff.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. Yeah, you're talking.
Is that right?
What point was that? 0.5% of people.
1 out of 200 people in your community has been killed in the last 5 weeks.
That's correct.
That's World War II, right? We haven't seen that since maybe parts of Vietnam and Cambodia, maybe, but this is, well, parts of Syria too. So yeah, and then the other thing I was thinking is, I've seen multiple interviews with children in Gaza. I think every single time they have ended the interview by saying that what they want to do when they grow up is be a resistance fighter. And I'm thinking, these are kids whose like brothers have been blown up in front of them. Their parents have been killed. Yada. I mean, and I think you'd be insane not to. I mean, how would you not want to kill Israelis? How would you not want to kill Israelis if you were born in Gaza? And then I'm thinking, so didn't the very first blockade begin in 2005? It was when there was a series of blockades, right? But it's basically
so actually really the blockades really began in 1990. I mean, people don't realize this, but we go back far enough, right? That's because recall that for the first 20 years of Israel's occupation of Gaza and the West Bank, Israel's policy was to try to push Palestinians into the Israeli labor market, cheap labor, and then they become dependent on Israel. And then in 1990, basically they changed the requirements such that there was no longer a general permit. You had to get an individual permit. And then from the 90s, and then throughout the 90s, Israel started to lock down and implement closures, essentially preventing Palestinians from leaving their towns and villages and cities to work in Israel after having made those same Palestinians dependent on the Israeli labor market. Right. And then in the second Intifada, it got even worse. So I think the correct way to think about the blockade is that it was a gradual blockade that began in the 90s and then tightened in 2007. Was really the period when it really began to tighten after June 2007, when Hamas took over power in Gaza, and then obviously became a complete and total blockade in just the past month.
Okay, so I mean, we don't know, but it looks like from all the video that the guys who did the attack on October 7th, were overwhelmingly, not surprisingly, young men.
Yeah.
which means that they have spent all or most of their life in, do you call it a concentration camp or a prison? Whatever.
I mean,
Either one. Yeah. I mean,
certainly I would say since October 7th, I would call it a concentration camp.
yeah, right. I mean, people, okay, let's do this fact also. I mean, people have been allowed to leave, but for particular reasons and only at the discretion of the Israeli government, right? So you want to talk about that? Who can leave and how do you leave Gaza if you live there?
So beginning in 2007, Israel imposed a land, air, and sea blockade on the Gaza Strip, which meant almost no one left, almost no one exited. Now, there are obviously some conditions, circumstances in which you could leave. So obviously many Gazans have dual citizenship. And many of those Gazans have been able to leave, primarily, I think, out of the Egypt border crossing, not through the Eretz crossing. So that's one way you can leave. You can apply for a number of permits, including a medical permit. The vast majority of those medical permits are denied. So, for example, I believe Israel denied something like 20,000 Palestinians in Gaza medical permits, exit permits for medical reasons in 2022. You could get, what are there other ways Palestinians could leave Gaza? You could get a student visa. So if you, let's say, get a Fulbright scholarship, it is possible to get a student visa. Again, there's a trickle. We're talking a tiny number of Palestinians. Work permits. So just recently, in the past year, Israel began to grant something like 18,000 Palestinians in Gaza work permits.
Right.
That was just the past year or two. And previously there had been occasional periods of time where work permits were granted, but for the most part, they were not. So, maybe for work, for study, if you have a foreign passport, for medical reasons, there are Gazans who have been able to leave, but again, we're talking about a trickle. The vast majority are not.
Right. So again, clearly most of the men who did the atrocities on October 7th have lived entirely or mostly in that place where they cannot leave. And also, I mean, where, as you've listed them, there have been periodic bombings of the place when it was enclosed. So I mean, I can't imagine not at least wanting to kill Israelis, not being super sympathetic, if not to Hamas, the political wing, to the Qassam brigades and the other militant factions, the other fighters, right? And that's what I've heard, by the way. Can you talk about that? How popular is Hamas, the political entity, within Gaza, and how popular is violent resistance, generally speaking? Those are two different things, right?
Yeah. So that's a good question. We don't have great polling data, in part because there's no free speech in Gaza. The Hamas government is autocratic. Look, in part because it was never really given a chance to rule. If you go back to 2007, after Hamas took power in the Gaza Strip, after having won free and fair democratic elections, the international community said, well, we supported democracy in Palestine, but we didn't support it when we didn't like the results.
Right.
But that's not how democracy works. So I don't think they were ever really given a fair chance. And in fact, immediately after they took over power in June 2007, Israel imposed a land, air, and sea blockade, and there were many attempts to challenge that blockade. Like Mavi Marmara in 2010, when the Israeli Navy boarded these humanitarian ships trying to break the blockade, and 11 people on board were gunned down and executed.
The Gaza flotilla? Yeah.
The Gaza flotilla. Right. But back to your question around kind of, is Hamas popular? My general sense is no, they're not. Again, we don't have great polling data, but my general sense is no, they're not. Here's why. So I think everyone likes free speech. I think that's like universal, and there's no free speech in Gaza. People generally like to, they don't like heavy-handed government involved in economic life. And so taxi drivers, for example, are being overtaxed. If you go get in a taxi driver in Gaza and ask them, like, what's it like being a taxi driver? They will tell you that Hamas officials are trying to impose taxes on them that they can't afford, they can't pay. The same is true of the bustans, all these street vendors. Hamas is pushing them out of certain areas, pushing them into other areas, trying to, again, impose a tax on them that they can't afford to pay. Okay, and the same is true of many sectors of the economy. You have Hamas-run farms. Hamas is playing a very active role in Gaza's economy. And it's actually pushing out whatever private sector exists in Gaza. Is actually, they're getting sidelined and pushed out as a result of Hamas's heavy hand in the economy. I don't think Gazans support that. I don't think Gazans, especially Gazan women, are especially happy about kind of what I would call very conservative Islamist ideology in Gaza. Certainly, Christians are not supporting that, and certainly many Muslim young women who want to be free and don't want to have to face as a kind of a conservative Islamist political ideology. I think they're opposed to Hamas's rule. And ultimately, I think the other issue is that the entire Hamas political leadership is like people above the age of 60.
Right.
I mean, we have the same problem in the United States, where we have 65, 75-year-old, senators and congresspeople making decisions about cryptocurrencies and artificial intelligence. They're asking, Mark Zuckerberg how you make money if Facebook is free. That's the level. I mean, that's what we're dealing with in the U.S., but you have the same problem in Gaza, where you have political leaders that are just totally out of touch with the people. And so for all those reasons, and so if you look at, for example, in the West Bank, young, even among Palestinians that support violence and support militant resistance, look at the Palestinian groups in the West Bank. They're not the new ones. They're not young people in the West Bank. They're not joining Hamas. They're creating new organizations called the Lion's Den and the Jenin Brigades. Okay, those are new organizations that reject the Fatah and Hamas. Why did they reject them? Because they failed Palestinians for the past 16 years. Fatah and Hamas have been divided, and there were attempts to reconcile. You had the Mecca agreement, you had the Doha agreement, the Cairo agreement. You had all these attempts to reconcile, but in the end, they all failed. And they failed to bring national unity to the Palestinian people, which is what you need in a struggle. You need unity. And the Palestinian leaders have failed at that. Hamas, first and foremost, failed to come to an agreement with Fatah. And so Palestinian young people look at these old, out of touch senior leaders who can't come to a unity agreement, who can't seem to bring any benefit to the Palestinian people, and so they reject that.
Okay, but how popular are the tactics employed by Hamas vis-a-vis Israel? In other words, the rockets and the occasional incursions in, and the Second Intifada, blowing up buses, all that stuff. Like, what's the rockets? Like, what do people think about that?
Well, I would say that in general, well, so first of all, let's talk about the law, international law. So international law allows people to resist military occupation with force.
Sure.
So if the rockets had more precision to them and were able to actually target Israeli military installations, they would be legal under international law. You are allowed to resist a military occupation with force. And in fact, a siege and a blockade, according to Israel, recall in 1967, it was the blockade of the Straits of the Straits that was preventing ships from accessing Eilat that led Israel to say that's an act of war. So a blockade is an act of war. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
And at least according to Israel, it is. Sure. And so when the Israeli military imposed a blockade on Gaza in 2007, guess what? That was also an act of war. So, do Palestinians have a right to defend themselves against military occupation and against siege and blockade, against war? Yes, of course. Do they have the capability to target military installations? No, they do not, because they're living in a state of siege and blockade. So perhaps they want to target the military, but they're not. They're being denied the right. They're being denied the right to abide by the laws of war.
Wow. Very important point, indeed.
So then the question is, like, do they support firing rock? Do they want innocent people to die? You should ask them, not me. Honestly, I don't know the answer to that. I imagine most do not. For the same reason, they don't want their own people to die, their own innocent people to die. I think, so I think the question is really charged and loaded. And I think more generally speaking, like, do Palestinians support resistance to military occupation? Yes, they do. Yes,
yeah, sure,
they do. Of course,
that
they
seems
do.
Clear. Yeah, right. But violent resistance, armed violent resistance, which I can't imagine not wanting that. I mean, if I were them, you know, in that position, but I would assume it's widespread, right? The embrace of that.
Look, I think, again, I think the vast majority of people, by the way, like including in Gaza and the West Bank, actually don't really think much or care much about politics. I think Palestinians are forced to think about politics. I think, but again, I think, you know, your average person in the world, including in Israel and Palestine, actually just want to find a good job and want to hang out with their friends on Friday nights and want to, you know, enjoy good food and raise a family and do all the things that we all love to do in life. And I think that's 90% of people, you know. So, you know, it's like, where on the order of priorities is violence for most people? Probably pretty low.
Right. One of the things you've done in your work that I think is extremely useful and important, and I'd love for you to talk about the history, is the history of nonviolent tactics by Palestinians. And you say this goes way back, and that there's a pretty rich history of it. Because this is the first thing. This is the second thing they ask you, you know, after they ask you to condemn Hamas. They say, well, where's the Palestinian Martin Luther King?
Right.
Why you guys just need your Martin Luther King, and then it'll be fine. Then we can negotiate with you and we can end the war. But until you do that we're gonna have to kill all your children. So what is the history of nonviolent resistance?
And let me just say, before, I would love to answer that question, but before answering it, let me just say, you know, when was the last time you heard someone ask, like, what, where's the Israeli Gandhi, right? Where is the Israeli peace movement? Where are the Israeli peace activists?
Well, they were around. I mean, they no longer really exist, but there was a very powerful.
Okay, but let's talk about right now. Where
Okay.
is the Israeli left today?
There's about 20 of them, I think. It seems like, right?
Where it's illegal inside Israel to hold a protest in solidarity with the people of Gaza. You will be arrested.
Right. Yeah.
You know, you see all these big protests around the world chanting for ceasefire, chanting for peace. If you do that in Israel, you'll be arrested. Wow. You know, so I mean, let's just keep in mind the context here of, like, the questions being asked by journalists, by podcasters, by interviewers is, where's the Palestinian nonviolent movement? When the fact is, it's now illegal in Israel to reject violence.
Whoa.
So okay, you know, but yeah, obviously there's a long history of Palestinian nonviolence.
Okay.
You know, obviously the first Intifada was primarily a nonviolent uprising in the first year.
87.
Yeah, so December 87, an Israeli truck driver kills 4 Palestinians, which came at the tail end of 20-year brutal military occupation, in which Israel killed on average 32 Palestinians per year for 32 years, or for 20 years.
Following the 1967 war and the occupation. Right.
Exactly right. So in 67, Israel conquers Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem. It imposes military occupation on millions of Palestinians, denies them the right to vote, denies them freedom of movement, deports many thousands from the occupied territories to outside of Palestine, to outside of Israel. It denies people the right to organize for political purposes. You cannot organize 10 people for a political cause. You cannot wave a Palestinian flag. You cannot use the name Palestine in the name of an association. You cannot paint a painting using red, white, green, and black, because that would be violent. And so anyways, at the tail end, and there's regular home demolitions, regular land confiscations,
and settlements, right? Settlements extending. Correct?
Expansion of settlements. In the 80s, Israel starts to really ramp up its settlement enterprise in the mid 80s. So you have basically this military occupation, which is brutal. And what do you know, after 20 years of this, Palestinians burst into open revolt, into nonviolent resistance, into protests. And in the first year in Gaza alone, the Israeli military slaughtered 142 Palestinians, and Palestinians killed 0 Israelis because it was a nonviolent revolt. Okay, so what happens when you resist nonviolently? You get slaughtered. That's what happened in 88. That, I think, also helps explain why Hamas transitions from a charity organization, which it was before 1988, to a militant resistance group, which it was after 1988. You have, throughout the 2000s, you have Israel builds a wall, 90% of which is built on Palestinian land, the quote-unquote security barrier. You have nonviolent protest movements that emerge all around the West Bank to resist this land confiscation, this land grab, and this attempt to sort of predetermine the borders, or basically, I would say, to kind of fence Palestinians into little cantons and little enclaves. I mean, that's really what I think the ultimate aim, I mean, in addition to providing Israeli security, but the route itself was determined along political lines.
Mm-hmm.
So you have all these protest movements. You have protest movements every single week, every Friday for years and years and years. In Bilain and Nilain and Nabi Saleh, and then more recently in Sheikh Jarrah and Beitah, all these protest movements. And guess what? In Beitah, Israel has killed more than a dozen Palestinian protesters. Again, all nonviolent, all picking up, Palestinian flags, marching and chanting, and the siege and the wall, and they get slaughtered. The same thing happened in Bilain. A friend of mine, Bassem Abu Rahmeh, was slaughtered at point blank range. They shot him in the chest with a tear gas canister and he died instantly. And the same thing happened in Nabi Saleh, where they killed multiple Palestinians. So these are nonviolent protesters getting slaughtered. Now let's talk about BDS. Boycott, divestment, sanctions, nonviolent movement. The whole organization is based around commitment to international law, commitment to nonviolence, and using economic means primarily. So boycotting companies that benefit from Israel's occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, and companies that are complicit with Israel's occupation. Elbit, weapons manufacturers in the UK, Hewlett-Packard, weapons technologies, surveillance technologies, all these companies that have factories in the West Bank, like Ben & Jerry's. So they had, operations in the West Bank. So all these companies that are basically benefiting from, profiting from, complicit in Israel's Israeli violence in the West Bank and Gaza. And guess what Israel did? It threatened with deportation the founder of the movement.
Right.
It called everyone who supports the movement anti-Semitic.
And
okay,
it did more than that. It did more than that too. It basically put pressure on all the universities in the United States to ban BDS from campus, right? And the attempts to pass laws banning it, and right.
There are something like 20 states in the United States where if you want to accept state funding, so like for example, let's say you're live in Texas, and there's a state emergency fund for hurricanes, for people who to help people who are victims of hurricanes. And in order to get the state money, you have to sign a document that says, I will not boycott Israel.
Right.
I'm like, wait, hold on one second. What does this have to do with like hurricane relief in Texas? But here we are. So, BDS, you are anti-Semitic and you will be deported. Now let's talk about the Gaza March of Return in 2018.
Yeah.
You have beginning in March 2018, you have Palestinians, civilians, activists marching to the wall in the many thousands, many tens of thousands on some days. And guess what happened? They were gunned down. They were slaughtered in the first few weeks from March 2018 until May 2018. Something like 30 to 40 Palestinians were slaughtered. And then on one day alone, May 14th, 2018, Israeli snipers massacred 60 unarmed Palestinians. Snipers. It was a massacre. They were aiming to kill. It was shoot to kill unarmed Palestinian protesters. Where was the international outrage? In fact, on the same day, on May 14th, you had, I believe it was President Donald Trump was he in Jerusalem at the time, declaring that the United States is going to move its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem on the same day.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
So here we are, Palestinians are being slaughtered. And then, at the same time, we have American presidents declaring that Israel's annexation of Jerusalem is legal.
So you're saying
is a war crime.
So you're saying for, more than 3 decades, there's been a long line of attempts by Palestinians to wage nonviolent protest for their rights, for their land, etc., and that it has been met with violence by Israel every time, and therefore they have been frustrated to the point where there is no alternative left but to send rockets in.
I think that is the conclusion that many Palestinians have come to.
Yeah.
I think it's certainly the conclusion of Hamas and Islamic Jihad that Israel only understands the language of force, and so force is what they will get. And that's the same thing, Israeli leaders have said in the past few weeks.
Yeah. All right. I want to do history now, deeper history, if you don't mind. And again, I want to see you answer that big question through history. So how would you answer the question of, do you condemn Hamas, Zach Foster, by looking at just 1917? So in other words, you know what I mean? Like, How would you bring 1917 to bear in answering the question of whether you condemn Hamas?
Well, maybe we can leave aside the condemnation of Hamas for a minute if you want to talk about 1917 and the Balfour Declaration.
Well, okay, you'll see what I mean, but go ahead. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, feel free to jump in and direct me if you want. But look, I think in order to understand the Balfour Declaration in 1917, I think you have to understand that every single Zionist leader from the 1880s until 1948 all asked themselves the same question. Theodore Herzl, Arthur Rupin, Ushkizin, Joseph Weitz, obviously Jabotinsky, right? So all the major Zionist thinkers, they all ask themselves the same question, which is, how is it that we are going to establish a Jewish state in a land that is majority non-Jewish, that is majority Palestinian Arab? And they came up with a few different answers. The dominant position, certainly by the 40s, I believe, was that we would have to expel them because they have a national identity and they have strong roots in the country, and they're not going to just leave on their own. And so, you know, to answer the question, what was 1917? 19 represented what I would say was the sort of the golden ticket for the Zionist enterprise, which was that, you know, prior to World War I, you know, Zionist settlement was illegal in the Ottoman Empire. You were not allowed to move to, if you were a Jew from the Pale settlement, from Romania, from Poland, and you established residency in Ottoman Palestine, you were an illegal alien. And the Ottoman Empire didn't do anything to kick you out. There was no enforcement, but you were living there illegally. Now, the Ottoman Empire said, look, Jews, you guys can move to Anatolia, move to Turkey and Asia, you know, move to Iraq, move to these other places, but you cannot establish a concentration of Jews in Palestine because the Ottoman Empire it has all these nationalist movements budding up all around the empire, right? The Armenians, the Arabs, Kurds, Turks, right? So you have all of these groups, the Assyrians, and now you have the Zionists. So you have all these groups basically, you know, claiming their nations, and they have the right to national self-determination within the Ottoman Empire. And so the last thing the empire wants is another nationalist movement that's calling for some, you know, self-rule within some part of the empire. Then comes World War I. The Ottomans tragically joined the war effort on the side of the Germans, and of course they lose the war, and Britain has already occupied Egypt, and so you have British forces who march north and take over Gaza already in November 1917, and then take over Jerusalem in December 1917, take over the rest of Palestine in 1918, and then declare Palestine a British mandate in 1922 that gets approved by the League of Nations in 1922. And the goal of the mandate is to facilitate Zionist immigration and Zionist land purchases. In other words, that this Balfour Declaration is incorporated into kind of the mandatory charter. And so it's the stated goal of the government to transform Palestine from an Arab country, from a country that's 90% Arab, to a Jewish country. And of course, the people are asked in 1919, the King Crane Commission is an American commission. They come to Palestine, they ask Palestinians, do you support the Zionist program? They asked them like 20 questions. One of them is, do you support a Zionist program? 85% of Palestinians say no. But the British didn't care. The British, this was not a democratic government. Right. There was no attempt to let the people, give the people any real say in the government that controlled the lives of, you know, a million plus of people in the land of Palestine. And so, lo and behold, you know, the Zionists are now moving to Palestine, and, you know, they're buying up land, all with the help and support of the British. And this leads to tremendous violence. Of course, this leads to violence because you just denied, you know, hundreds of thousands of people political rights. You basically just said, we're going to turn your country into a Zionist paradise. Well, of course, there's going to be violence as a result. So maybe that does kind of get back to your question of trying to like loop in Hamas here. But, you know, yeah, of course, there's going to be violence when you tell people that you're going to deny, you know, a million people the right to have a say in the government that rules over their lives.
And you are suggesting, it sounds like, that there wasn't much violence prior to 1917 between Jews and Arabs in Palestine. Is this right?
Yeah, that's basically correct. There were a few incidents of violence. I think the first incidents dates already to the 1880s. 1886, I believe, in Petah Tikva, there was a kind of these are land disputes in the 1880s and 1890s, right? Because you have Zionist immigrants who buy the lands associated with a village and kick out and then push out the Palestinians who are living there because they bought the land from an absentee landlord living in Beirut or Jerusalem or Jaffa.
Right, but you're saying, I mean, yes, what I meant was prior to Zionism, which begins in earnest in the 80s and 90s. But so you're saying before then, before Zionist settlers show up in Israel, it's essentially peaceful between the two peoples.
Yes, I would say that's correct. Look, I don't want to pretend for a minute that the Ottoman Empire didn't have problems and that there wasn't religious or ethnic discrimination in the Ottoman Empire. Of course there was. But on average, especially zooming out, comparing Jews and Muslims under Ottoman rule versus Jews and Christians under Christian rule, Jews fared much, much better under the Ottomans than they did under Christians in Europe. And specifically in Ottoman Palestine, you didn't really have any major conflicts or any major outbreaks of violence between Muslims and Jews in Ottoman Palestine for many, many decades prior to Zionist immigration in Palestine. In fact, you have many anecdotes of Palestinian, of Muslims and Jews and Christians celebrating each other's holidays together. In places like Sheikh Jarrah, you had where there's a famous Jewish mystic who's buried in Sheikh Jarrah, and Jews would go picnic there, and Muslims would join them on Jewish holidays. And the same was true of Jews celebrating Ramadan together with Muslims. And so I would say, there was a great deal of intercommunal harmony. And then on top of all that, I think what made the Ottoman Empire special was that, especially in the latter, I mean, don't get me wrong, the Ottoman Empire committed a bunch of horrible atrocities, massacred Armenians, obviously the Armenian genocide during World War I and the Assyrian genocide. Right? So the Ottoman Empire did all these horrible things. But when it came to trying to build, I think, a shared identity that cut across religious and ethnic and national boundaries, they did a decent job. They tried to build an Ottoman identity. Okay, and an Ottoman identity meant you could be Jewish, you could be Muslim, you could be Armenian, you could be anything, and you could be an Ottoman. And I don't think, I don't think really any government in the land of Palestine or Israel has managed to achieve that since. Israel is a Jewish state. It's for Jews, where Jews have special rights and special privileges. And 80 to 90% of the land cannot be purchased by non-Jews. And, Jews serve in the military, and thus they get special rights and privileges because of that. And Jews get, a special funding. The Jewish religious institutions, Jewish Orthodox schools get special funding, right? So it's a Jewish state and the Jewish National Fund is part of the state of Israel. And the Jewish National Fund's explicit mission is to, develop and settle land for Jews and Judaize the South and Judaize the North. And it's all about what's good for Jews. And so in that type of state, obviously, and so when you're comparing kind of Israel as a Jewish state versus the Ottoman Empire as an Ottoman state, I think the Ottomans fare much better.
I haven't actually done the research on this, so I'm not totally sure it's true, but I've heard a few experts on this say that the rabbi of Jerusalem at the time of the Balfour Declaration said that the Jews of Jerusalem would prefer rule under the Ottomans or even the British to the Zionists. That I think he's the original sort of Haredi Jew, the anti-Zionist Jews who still live in Jerusalem that no one knows about. But yeah, that makes some sense to me, what you're saying here. So let's see. So here's what I've been hearing from big proponents of Israel and what it's doing in the last 5 years. These are the things I've heard. So do you condemn Hamas? You don't. Okay, therefore, I don't know, we should bomb children. Number 2 is that when the Zionists arrived in Palestine at the turn of the 20th century, it looked like North America, when Columbus came. It was undeveloped. These were not productive people. The fields lay fallow. They weren't doing much with the land. And the Zionists came along, and these industrious Jews came from Europe and applied all their, Jewish, economic magic. And look what we've got. We've got this high-tech paradise that was built by these very productive Jews. And if we had let the Palestinians hold and control that land for the last century, it would be a dusty desert. So this is why we should allow Israel to win, which is really the argument. And this is like I sort of respect the argument on it's like a Nietzschean thing. It's like, not against this, it's against the slave morality idea of, we should let the victors be winners because they're the winners, they're the better people, they're the more productive and useful people, and let the people who are not so productive die off. So is that true, first of all? Like, as of around 1890, 1900, what did it look like?
There's a few issues here. One is like, if you are developmentally advanced, does that give you a right to ethnically cleanse the native population? I think
yes.
Obviously no. Okay.
Well, that's what's being said, man. I mean, that is exactly what's being said. That's exactly right. This is this is an argument that's been deployed by Zionists for a long time, right? It's not. This is not.
If you have sophisticated scientific methods, do you have the right to commit war crimes? No. Okay, so let's talk about the actual question here, which is like, what is the state of Palestine on the eve of Zionist immigration? I would encourage your listeners to check out a book by Alexander Scholz called Palestinian Transformation from 1856 to 1882.
Great.
That's the time period. It's a fascinating book. I mean, it's an academic book, right? So it's good bedtime reading, put you to sleep quickly. But but I think this is obviously like part of the Zionist mythology, right? That land for a people without a land. The land was barren. We drained the swamps. We made the desert bloom. But obviously, this is all mythology, right? I mean, in fact, Palestine. I mean, first of all, I don't want to pretend here like Palestine is like the center of economic progress and development in the Ottoman Empire. No, it is not. But you have a number of significant economic transformations in the second half of the 19th century. You have a growing export industry. So you have out of Gaza, you have a growing export industry of wheat and barley to the British beer industry. You have a growing citrus industry. So the major export out of Palestine by the eve of World War I. In the last year, citrus became the number 1 export with these massive orange groves based around Jaffa and Gaza, and close to the coast. So you have a huge citrus industry. You also have tobacco exports. You have cotton exports coming out of the interior from places like Nablus and Jenin. You also have soap exports. Nablus is a big exporter of soap and olive oil, obviously. In the Galilee, you have a lot of wheat grown. So Palestine is, especially in the Galilee, you have a lot of wheat. Jerusalem is a center for religious pilgrims. So between the late 19th century to World War I, you have a massive increase in tourism. Palestine is becoming a center of tourism. The tourism that we know, love, and hate today began in the 19th century. So you have, by the eve of World War I, the estimates are you have 40,000 tourists and pilgrims coming to Palestine every year. So that gives rise to a new industry of hotels and shopkeepers and merchants and transportation companies, shuttling, pilgrims from Jaffa to Jerusalem. You have a train. The Ottomans built a train connecting Jerusalem and Jaffa. They built a train on the coast connecting Beirut to Haifa, to Jaffa, to Gaza, all the way to Egypt. So you have Ottomans, expanding public squares. You have introduction of municipal councils. There's a tremendous amount going on in Palestine in the late Ottoman period. Okay. Obviously not known to Zionists who don't really care about the native inhabitants, who are the native inhabitants are invisible. They don't exist. Right. But that's obviously false.
Wow. I didn't know any of that. That's great. I'm going to look at that, but can you say the name of the author in the book again?
Yeah, it's a German author. His name is, I believe, Alexander Scholz. I believe it's spelled SCHOLSH or CH, something like that.
Okay.
Yeah. The title of the book is Palestine in Transformation, 1856 to 1882.
Gotcha. Okay. Just before Zionism.
Correct.
Basically, yeah. So your dissertation in your academic work is centered around the question of, as I take it, Palestinian identity.
That's correct.
And your dissertation is entitled, isn't it called Inventing Palestine, the Invention of Palestine?
That's correct.
Yeah. So the line I hear is that what is the line? The line is that the line is 1964, right? The line is that Palestinian identity was created in 1964 by Yasser Arafat, I believe, that's the standard Israeli line on this, that there was no such thing as a Palestinian identity. The people who lived in Palestine didn't identify as such before 64. it's an invention by the Palestinian resistance for political purposes. So it's all a big social construct that's very new, and therefore, I guess, not terribly legitimate, and we shouldn't worry too much about it. So
Yes,
what's
all
wrong with
that
that?
is
What's wrong with that, Dr. Foster?
okay. So let me let me just say first of all that whether or not the first Palestinian came around in 1964 or 1864 or 1764, that is unrelated to ethnic cleansing. It doesn't have anything to do with expelling Palestinians from
Sure.
Humsa or Ain Sosia or Musafriyata. Okay,
Right.
those are
Sure,
different
of course.
questions.
Right.
One is an academic question. It's an interesting question. It's a question of history. The other is a question of human rights, which are, again, they're unrelated. So let's just be clear about that first of all.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so the first people to call themselves Palestinians, as far as I can tell, started to do so in the late 19th century. So the first guy, his name is Khalil Beidas. In 1898, he publishes a book called The Holy Land. It's actually a translation of a book of a Russian archaeologist book. And throughout the book, he mentions the word, Palestinian peasant, Palestinian farmer, Palestinian people. That's in 1898. But actually, even two and a half decades before that, in 1870, James Finn, who at that time was a British consul in Jerusalem, he writes a memoir in which he's calling the native inhabitants of Palestine, the Arabic-speaking inhabitants of Palestine, Palestinian in that book. So if he's using it, we're also the natives using it in 1870, question mark. You also have a number of other American travelers. I've written about this. One of whose name is Adela Orphan. We can link to the paper that I published about these sources, but you do have already in the 1880s and 1890s other German and American and British and Russian sources using that term, and then the term gets picked up by Khalil Beidas, and then already in 1901 you have Najib Nassar publishes an article in which the title of the article is "A Palestinian Describes a Palestinian Town." It's an Arabic article published in an Arabic language journal that's published out of Iskandariya, Alexandria in Egypt. And then you have another guy, Salim Kobain, who publishes the same an article under the same title in the same magazine a few months later. And then, over the course of the next decade and a half, from 1898 to 1914, you have something like 126 references to the word Palestinian in Arabic language sources. And I published a paper in which I've documented every single one of those sources, every single article that mentions that. So it's like the paper itself is 5 pages and the appendix is like 20 pages because, it's just like, let's just establish facts and understand that, like, no, this identity did not it was not used for the first time in 1964. It was not used for the first time in 1948. It was not used for the first time in 1917. As far as I can tell, it goes back to at least 1898. And again, I'm sure a more diligent scholar who has access to more resources and who spends more time looking will probably find an earlier reference than that.
So okay, good enough for me. I mean, I believe you that the term Palestinian was being used in the 19th century. What is more, I think, interesting and important to me, at least, is what Palestinian identity came to mean, right? And what constituted a Palestinian identity. So, like in the United States, in the 19th century, there was this whole big project taken up by many people to construct the American identity. And we were told, right, by many authorities, what being an American is. Right. One is being, independent and able to survive in the wilderness and all these things. Did that go on in the 20th century with the development of a Palestinian national identity? Were particular characteristics or attributes attached to it by Palestinians themselves? I don't mean by outsiders. I mean by within Palestine, among Palestinians who were self-identifying. Did they say Palestinians are X, Y, and Z?
Yeah, so there's a really interesting article published in the newspaper Palestine in 1911. And I can't remember when the article dates to. Maybe it's 1912, maybe it's 1911, by a guy named Jobran Matar. And he's from, is it Beit Jala? I believe he's from Beit Jala, which is near Bethlehem in the West Bank, what is currently the West Bank. And it's this front page article in the newspaper where he's like, Palestine. Like it's like it was almost like he took a lesson on what nationalism is, and it was almost like he then, after learning about what nationalism is, he wrote this like front page article about Palestine, right? It's like, oh, the heroes and the saints all like buried in Palestine. Oh, like from the river to the sea, we have the most beautiful mountains and the most beautiful valleys, and these are the rivers of Palestine, and it's the home of all the major religions, and it has such a rich history. So that article dates back to 1911. Okay. So, I mean, and this is the beginning. I mean, from that point forward, you have dozens and dozens of Palestinians kind of saying similar things.
Okay.
So yeah, I think really go ahead.
No, but I mean, what were they saying about themselves, right? What were they saying about what it is to be a Palestinian? Does it mean, that you're more courageous than other people? Does it mean that you're more kind than other people, more compassionate? Does it mean you're willing to take up arms in jihad? You know what I mean? Like, is there any evidence in there, an amenability to violence? I mean, or anything?
No.
This is what's said, and I'm asking the expert on the history of Palestine.
Gotcha.
That violence, right, is baked into Palestinian identity. That's exactly what is said, right?
Gotcha. That's interesting. I actually didn't know that was. I hadn't really heard that before. So that's.
But yes, like, you have.
About like the essence of being a Palestinian means to be violent. That's kind of the argument made by some propagandists, is kind of what you're saying.
This is, of course, you've heard this. This is the entire argument. This is all that's said. I mean, no, they say it's a culture of death. You've heard that, right?
Sure. Sure. I see your point. Point. Okay.
So the culture of death, the culture of violence, the culture of jihad, is that a thing historically in the construction of Palestinian national identity?
I mean, one way to maybe get at this question would be to look at some of these Palestinian proposals for Palestinian flags that surfaced in the Palestinian newspapers in the 20s and 30s and 40s.
Cool, yeah.
Which might give you kind of some sense of like what Palestinians think of like the content or the essence that of a Palestinian identity. Because like what else? What better represents Palestinian identity than like the flag, right? And so there was a very interesting paper published by a guy named Tamir Sorek, I believe, already 10, 15 years, 20 years ago. I mean, there's nothing new about this research, but he reviews all these proposals from Palestinian newspapers at the time, and some of the proposals found their way into the Israeli state archives. And there are maybe 3 or 4 or 5 different themes that emerge in the proposals. Number one is the colors. So the colors are almost always basically green, red, black, and white. And I think the reason is because those were the colors of the Arab flag during the Arab revolt during World War I. And so I think like if you have to identify what is like critical to the content, kind of the backdrop of a Palestinian identity, it's that we're Arab. We speak Arabic.
Okay.
We have an identity associated with Arabic culture.
Okay.
And Arabic customs and Arabic history. So I think Arab identity is really critical to understanding Palestinian. Of course, there are lots of Arabs all over the place, so then the question is, okay, well, what's unique about us? There are a few symbols that tend to appear on some of these flag proposals. Number one, and the most common one, is the Dome of the Rock. It's the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Okay. I think that is such an important Palestinian symbol. I mean, I think for obvious reasons, right? Like it's the third holiest site in all of Islam. And here it is in Palestine, in Jerusalem.
Wow.
And so I think that site plays a critical role. And if you can understand the Palestinian connection to that site, I think you can understand a lot of the source of conflict over the past 140 years.
In particular, October 7th, because the Al-Aqsa Mosque was threatened very recently by settlers and politicians who want to, make it into the theological thing? They want to make it into the synagogue that has some particular relevance or significance. What is it?
Yes, that's correct. You have some settlers that want to destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque and turn it into the third temple.
Right.
Yeah. So I think, and so even if you look at many of the instances of violence going back all the way to during the Ottoman period, there were threats. There were archaeological digs in and around the mosque that led to violence. And then in 1929, in the lead up to the infamous Hebron massacre, which is probably like the favorite moment in Zionist history, is when Palestinians committed these massacres against Jews. They love talking about that, right? Because it was indefensible. You had massacres. But what led up to that was you had all these Zionists talking about, we're going to take over the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Right. What do you know? What do you know?
Right.
So that has been a source. And then, of course, that's what led to the May 2021 war, was when Israeli military forces entered the Al-Aqsa Mosque and started shooting tear gas and stun grenades at Palestinian worshippers. Oh, and what do you know? War breaks out afterwards.
Right.
So, I think that the Al-Aqsa Mosque has long played a critical role in the content, the substance of a Palestinian identity. I would also say, there were other symbols. There was one Palestinian that submitted a proposal that an orange should be in the center of the flag, right? Because remember what I said, citrus exports were the #1 exports of Palestine in 1914. And it was really gave rise to kind of a Palestinian upper middle class of merchants and businessmen in places like Jaffa and places like Gaza, was because of the because of the orange exports. And then you had I think another proposal was someone put like a barley, a stock of barley and wheat. So remember the basis of Palestine. And then maybe you also had one proposal for an olive. Like the olive is a kind of, the olive oil and the importance of, the olive tree to the Palestinian landscape and Palestinian culture.
You know what it sounds like? I mean, it sounds like, this is a generalization, but it's probably true. It sounds like in general, Palestinians before the state of Israel was established were very interested in international trade. Is that right? Like, is there?
Well, what I would say is Palestinians were an agricultural people.
Yeah.
Okay, 75% of Palestinians up until 48 were not urban Palestinians. They were rural Palestinians.
Right.
They were villagers. They were farmers.
Right.
They toiled the soil. They harvested the crops. They harvested wheat and barley, and olives and citruses and every single vegetable you could possibly imagine. Right. So the Palestinians were an agricultural people. So of course they had agricultural symbols. They were also religious people. So they had religious symbols. I would say those would be kind of, if I had to identify, it would be, the land, connection to the land, and really all the symbols and elements of the land, like the mountains, like the rivers, like the valleys, like the citruses and like the plants and the crops. So I think the land first and foremost, and then also the religious symbols. Those would be the two main, I would say, kind of pieces of content or substance that really form kind of the basis of like what it means to be Palestinian, let's say before 48.
Okay, great. Now I'm gonna drill down on this question though, because I have seen quite a lot of footage and just read a lot, and it just seems to me very clear that at least today, as of today, and it certainly seems true in Gaza, I think it's probably true in the West Bank as well, that there is a culture of death. There is a culture of death. So there are posters made, I think, of every person who's killed, a martyr poster. I guess Hamas makes these posters and they're placed around. People put them up as symbols of honor. And there are just many, many, many testimonies of Palestinian mothers and fathers, saying, yes, I will be honored if my child will be a shaheed, will become a martyr for the cause. Now, I think where I'm coming from on this, right? So I'm not saying this to judge them or to dismiss them. I'm asking you this though, as the historian of these people, is that only found post Nakba? Is that only found in the culture, this culture of death, which it has to be called that, I think. A nation, the leader of Hamas called Palestine a nation of martyrs. Do you find that only, again, sort of in response to or as a result of the occupation, the displacement, colonization, etc.? Or is it more organic to Palestinian identity?
I mean, I think the first question is like, why is it that both Zionists and Palestinians glorify their military leaders? Right. I believe the name of the airport in Tel Aviv is called the Ben Gurion Airport, the chief architect of the ethnic cleansing of 750,000 Palestinians, who also played a role in massacring many Palestinians. So I think the question is really fraught with bias, because I think if you go around Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, it's like the names of the streets are like war heroes and warlords and people who committed massacres. Menachem Begin was responsible for killing 96 people in the King David hotel bombing in 1946, and he's a hero, right? So I think I'm not really sure I agree with the premise of the question. I think both Zionists and Palestinians glorify their heroes, their military heroes. But I think to kind of get at the question, which is like, all Zionist leaders had to ask themselves the same question, right? Which is, how does it you establish a Jewish state in a land that's not Jewish? All Palestinians had to ask themselves also a different question, which is, how do you what is the best way to resist a group of people hoping to eventually make all of the important decisions over your life? Okay.
Yes, right.
They all ask themselves that same question, because that was ultimately the Zionist goal, which was to establish a Jewish state in a non-Jewish land. And so every Palestinian had to ask themselves, like, what am and by the way, and that's why the fault lines in Palestinian society, you know, in the 20s, 30s, and 40s was, you know, how should I basically, like, you know, how violent or how non-violent should I be? It's the same question they asked themselves in the 1920s as they're asking themselves in the 2020s. No difference, because the Zionist project hasn't changed. It's exactly the same.
Right.
And so Palestinians, of course, so the question is, like, do I, you know, meet with them and try and come to a political dialogue and try and negotiate and accept a British rule in Palestine and accept the British laws encouraging Zionist immigration and encouraging? Should I work within that framework and just try and be nice to them and convince them, like, maybe if I'm nice enough to them, you know, and I'm complicit enough in what they're doing, then maybe they'll listen to me and they won't be as, you know, they won't perpetrate as much violence on me as they would have otherwise? Or do you take the more militant position, which is, no, I'm going to resist and I reject this? And that's been the question all Palestinians have asked themselves for 140 years.
Yeah, it's interesting it's interesting you said that Zionism has not changed as a project, and that's my basic position, is that, and that is, to me, that's the basic problem that essentially explains really everything for the last 100 years, is the project, the idea of Zionism being enacted in real time in a real place. So you identify as an anti-Zionist, and by the way, I haven't, until maybe the last 5 weeks. That's what's changed. I've been sort of agnostic on. I've just been opposed to supporting Israel, opposed to, like, my country, my government giving any support to Israel. But I felt like it's not my thing, not my place to take a position. But I feel like it's sort of just for the sake of human life, it's necessary to be an anti-Zionist these days. But what does that mean to you? What does anti-Zionism mean to you? I mean, this is a question, again, that comes from the Zionist side, you know, which is actually a good question. Like, if you asked me this, you know, if you asked someone, an anti-Zionist, this, you know, 50 years ago, it'd be relatively easy to talk about, because the nation was only 20 years old. There hadn't been multiple generations born there, which to me is the problem. There weren't all these settlements. What is it, 600,000 people in settlements in the West Bank now? You know, establishing facts on the ground, as I think Netanyahu said. What does this mean now to be an anti-Zionist? You want to abolish the state of Israel? What does that mean?
Yeah, great question. Let me just say, first of all, it's not just Zionism that I reject. I think I reject all ideologies, political ideologies, that claim that a state should serve the interests other than its citizens. And so you have and by the way, I reject all ideologies that claim that a state should serve the interests of one particular ethnic or religious group over the others.
Right.
So for the same reason I'm anti-Zionist, I reject, you know, Hutu domination over Tutsis in Rwanda, and I reject Arab domination over the Nabateans in Sudan, and I reject Shia domination over Sunnis in Iraq. Right. So there's nothing special about Zionism. What's special is that I was raised a Zionist,
right,
rather than raised to be a Sudanese nationalist or a Rwandan nationalist. Right. But yeah, I mean, obviously, I think that movements, political ideologies that say that, like, the purpose of our state is basically to privilege one of the ethnic groups within our state, that's a recipe for a catastrophe. That's what led to the Holocaust. So yeah, so for me, anti-Zionism is kind of like, not really, I don't think there's anything special about being an anti-Zionist. I'm kind of, I would say, almost more an anti-ethno-nationalist is what I really am.
Okay. I know, but what does that mean in terms of your position on Israel today? Like, what do you call for right now to be done in Israel?
Well, I think, you know, first of all, what would be the practical implication? You should stop putting people's religion on their ID cards. You should stop when you have a municipal council, a city council, should not be able to ask this person, you know, what their identity is before they are allowed to move into the community, into the moshav or the kibbutz. You should not be allowed to discriminate on the basis of ethnic or religious identity in the state of Israel.
Okay, like, so give them all a vote. I mean, everybody,
Well,
all the previous inhabitants too. You're saying all the residents of Palestine should be given a vote.
well, hold on. Let's get to that in a
Okay.
second. But I'm just
Okay.
saying, like within the borders of the state of Israel,
Yeah.
right?
Okay.
There's
Hmm.
legal discrimination against non-Jews.
Right.
You
Okay.
know, 80%, 80 to 90% of the land of the state of Israel cannot be bought by non-Jews.
Right.
People don't realize this, you
Right.
know, but actually in terms of the physical land, it is, most of it is off limits to non-Jews.
So for people who don't know, so there is an Arab, the very large Arab population, Palestinian population in Israel, Israeli citizens. There's about 3 million, I think, something like that.
1.6 million Palestinian citizens of the state of Israel.
Oh, half of that. Okay, 1.5 in Israel itself. And you're saying, and I've heard this from other people too. I haven't looked into it, but I'm sure you're right. That they have most of the rights of Israeli citizens, but not all. And I guess in terms of land in particular, right? Land ownership, they do not have the rights that Israeli Jews have.
Yeah, people don't. Yeah, so basically, you have all these committees. So think of all the moshavim, all the kibbutzim, all these little towns, and you know, because most towns are small,
Mm-hmm.
and actually control a lot of land within the town limits, the city limits, within the moshav and kibbutz, and those village councils and city regional councils have the right to determine whether or not someone can buy land within their kind of municipal or village or kibbutz council, and there's been many cases where Palestinians have tried to buy land and they've been denied the right to. And in practice, I think the assessment of the human rights organizations in Israel, Al-Haq and Adala has published reports on this, that there have been many cases and they've been denied the right to buy that land because they say they're not suitable. You know, it's always, again, of course, it's not, you know, there's always an excuse, right? They're not suitable. You know, we just don't think they're suitable to live in this community, right? So, but yeah, basically institutionalized discrimination. So
yeah, okay. So you would do that to full civil rights for the current citizens of Israel. Okay.
Correct.
Then what?
So then now to talk about Gaza and the West Bank, I mean, you know, what needs to happen? I think what needs to happen is that Israelis and Palestinian leaders need to sit down at the table as equals. And there needs to be some kind of negotiated resolution. And that's up to them to figure out what that resolution looks like. But it has to be in a framework within which Palestinians and Israelis are equal. If they're not equal, we're going back to Oslo, because that was the case during Oslo, where they were not equal, where Israel was both the party to the Oslo Accords, but was also the enforcer of the Oslo Accords, being the only sovereign between the river and the sea. And so that can't happen. You need, and because Israel is the only sovereign between the river and the sea, you do really, I think, need some kind of international force. Maybe it's the United States. Hard to imagine them being a sort of equal broker of making sure that both sides have an equal seat at the table. But that's what needs to happen. And they can decide whether it's one state or two states or 5 states or whatever. But like, they need to be equal, and there needs to be a political negotiated outcome.
So you don't favor one state, two state. You don't take a position on that.
I might have an opinion about what I think makes the most sense. And, you know, at least in my mind, Israel's not going to withdraw from the settlements. It's not going to give up control of the Jordan Valley. It's not going to give up control of the Temple Mount or of the Palestinian neighborhoods of East Jerusalem. It's not going to give up control of the water. It's not going to give up control of the airspace. It's not going to give up control of the population registry or the telecommunication networks or the electricity. And because of that, I just don't ever see a world in which Palestinians will ever be given real sovereignty. Now, maybe I'm wrong about those things. Maybe an Israeli Gandhi comes around and says, no, we actually will give you guys real sovereignty. But I don't see that happening. Certainly not now. Maybe a month ago, you might say there's a 0.1% chance of that happening. And now it's 0. Yeah. But, you know, I don't see that happening. And so I think I think what inevitably will happen will be that Palestinians in the occupied territories will demand, once most of them realize that Israel will never grant them sovereignty, and that military resistance consistently fails to achieve any kind of political outcome. I think once you have Palestinians that realize that, then they're going to demand what blacks in the United States demanded, which is just treat us equal within the state of Israel if you're not going to give us our own state. So I don't know. I think many will already have. But again, it's not really up for me to decide what solution they choose. It's kind of up to Palestinians and Israelis to negotiate and as equals and come to a political resolution.
Okay, so for you, being an anti-Zionist does not mean you're calling for the destruction of the state of Israel.
No, of course not.
Okay. you want to radically reform state of Israel.
Well, yeah, I want a state of Israel that does not it does not make decisions, it does not pass laws or based on ethnic or religious identity. We have a nation state law which says Jews are have primacy in the state of Israel. But this is 2017, where they enshrine Jewish supremacy in the state of Israel. Like, that's what I'm opposed when we're talking about, and that Jews have special rights, that Jews can migrate anywhere in the world to Israel, that Jews, why is it, again, that I think we started the conversation this way, or maybe this was another interview, I forgot, but like, why is it that I have a right to move to Israel and get Israeli citizenship when a Palestinian who was born there does not have that right? That's insane.
Yeah, you said that earlier. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. But I mean, again, if you introduce political reforms to such a degree that Palestinians have equal political rights in a democracy, that means there is no more Jewish state, right? Because the Palestinians are a majority there. And so if they're a majority in a democracy, presumably they will vote at least, at the very least, against there being a Jewish state, right? So
sure, but what I'm saying is abandon the idea of the Jewish state long before you let any Palestinians in. Like, the idea of a Jewish state is a problem.
Oh, so you are an anti-Zionist. So you are calling for abolishing.
Remember what I said was any state that privileges one of its ethnic groups over the other ethnic groups that live inside of it is a problem.
Yeah. No, I completely agree with you. I'm just getting at, what this means ultimately and why Zionists oppose it. Right.
Do I think Jews in Israel should be expelled and sent back to Poland? No, of course not. That would be ethnic cleansing. You can't do that's what I'm criticizing.
No, I know. Of course. Yeah. No, they should be expelled to New York where they're actually safe. But anyway. All right.
Yeah.
Zach, this has been a really fantastic conversation, and I've learned a lot from you. And thank you for doing all the work you've been doing. This has been, for me, and I'm not nearly as invested as you are. I mean, I've studied it for a while, but I mean, it's been a horrific 5 weeks. Watching these things from afar. It must be incredibly just difficult for you. And I just want to say thank you for doing that and going through it and doing all these interviews and putting this information out there that is so desperately needed.
It's my pleasure, and thanks so much for hosting and bringing me on and for talking about Israel Palestine right now. Really appreciate it.
Awesome. All right, man. Thank you.
Okay.
Peace.
Take care. Be well.
Yeah. This is the Unregistered Podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. To become a patron of the show and have access to bonus episodes, AMAs, and the Unreported News Analysis Show, go to patreon.com/unregistered. Thanks for listening.